We need a constitutional amendment. We need to move our economy towards sustainable sources of energy. Here's another brutal truth. The United States of America is only 15% of global emissions. So if we really want to get the best of climate change, we have to make it so that countries in Africa and the developing world choose wind and solar over coal.
Presidential candidate Andrew Yang wants to make some radical changes when it comes to the environment, including an amendment to the Constitution that would move the U.S. away from coal and towards solar. Certainly not the only candidate, though, with some innovative plans to combat climate change. In the case of Julian Castro, he wants to see a social justice component to addressing climate issues.
And so my plan actually calls for new civil rights legislation to be able to address environmental injustice, including making sure that there is a private right of action to go to file lawsuits against polluters. This is the way that it used to be until a Supreme Court case a few years ago.
Joining us now to give his take on those who shined and those who might have gone dim during the CNN town hall is Michael Mann. He's the Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. We appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So give us, in your estimation, which of the candidates gave the best vision for solving the climate issue, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, there were bits and pieces that I liked from pretty much all of the candidates. So the ideal climate candidate would be sort of an amalgamation of a number of different candidates. I would have to say that overall, I thought that Elizabeth Warren demonstrated the best sort of fundamental understanding of the problem, appreciation of the nature of the solutions to that problem, and very importantly, an ability to explain it clearly to an audience, because ultimately a president who's going to act on climate is going to encounter resistance, and they're going to be able to make their case. And I thought Elizabeth Warren did the best job doing that. But again, there were bits and pieces I liked from pretty much every one of the candidates. And any one of the people on that stage would be infinitely better than the current president, Donald Trump. And I'm including Wolf Blitzer in that.
I thought Warren was also very effective. She had this moment, they're copying these questions about like the plastic straws and hamburgers and these sorts of things. I thought she had a very good and telling response. Let's take a listen to a little bit of that and then I'll get your response.
But understand, this is exactly what the fossil fuel industry hopes we're all talking about. That's what they want us to talk about. This is your problem. They want to be able to stir up a lot of controversy around your light bulbs, around your straws, and around your cheeseburgers. When 70% of the pollution, of the carbon that we're throwing into the air comes from 3 industries.
Now, you have a very unique and personal insight into the way that the fossil fuel industry organizes to make sure that nothing changes. What did you think of Warren's response here?
Yeah, I really appreciated that response, and it really, it reinforces, my own views on this, that we're sort of, moving past outright denial of the science. And as you allude to, I've had tangles with climate change deniers for literally decades now because of the iconic hockey stick graph that we published some years ago that demonstrates the reality and threat of climate change. But I think denial is now taking a different form. It's very difficult to deny that something's happening because people can see it with their own 2 eyes. It's clear that we are suffering the impacts of climate change in the form, for example, of more devastating storms like the one that's about to make landfall in the southeastern U.S., Dorian. So it's difficult to deny climate change is happening or real. So instead, we see the emergence of sort of softer, gentler denialism. And one aspect of that is what I call the deflection campaign. It's industry special interests, polluters, trying to distract us by talking about things like hamburgers and straws and creating division, sowing division and dissent within the community of climate activists, getting them arguing about their own individual carbon footprints and what's the most responsible way to act on climate, generating that internal division to prevent sort of a unified sort of movement, to interfere with a unified voice for action. And so I was very pleased that she emphasized that. and emphasized the fact that any real solution is going to require that we target the vast majority of these carbon emissions that are coming from energy production, transportation, and a result of the fossil fuel industry's continuing efforts to prevent us from transitioning away to cleaner technology.
Professor, don't you think Andrew Yang does have a point, though, that if the United States even were to cut, it's only responsible for 15% of these emissions? Now, I've spoken quite a bit about China here. I did not hear China and an approach to take on China from any of these Democratic candidates. How do you think that the Democratic candidates should be thinking about climate on an international scale and reining in some of the developing world polluters, who are the worst by far?
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that figure. I'd have to double check it because it sounds a bit low. But the U.S. and China are the world's two largest emitters right now. That remains true. And that means that there's particular symbolic significance of those two actors, of us and China. We are basically sending a message to the rest of the world. And if we don't have our own house in order, it makes it very difficult for other countries who haven't yet exploited this dirty, cheap energy technology to say, don't we deserve our turn as well? So it's especially important that a president engage in the necessary international diplomacy to bring not just China on board, but the rest of the world. And we had that under Barack Obama. We've obviously lost that with a president, Donald Trump, who's actually threatening to be the one country that would pull out of the Paris Accord. Clearly,
but the criticism of Paris is that it didn't actually do anything. I mean, the Chinese are not necessarily set to reach their targets, that there's no actual enforcement mechanisms. Whenever it comes to these things, it sounds like a lot of the other things that the Chinese agree to, and then they just don't do it. So if there's going to be an international accord or something, then it would have to actually have enforcement mechanisms. And I think this is where a differing worldview with that comes into play. What do you think about that in terms of enforcement mechanism?
Yeah, that remains to be seen, and that's always been a thorny issue.
Yeah.
The idea behind the Paris Agreement is sort of a name and shame approach, that we will internationally, bring pressure to bear. We will shame those countries that don't meet their commitments. And so here is my view of what the problem is with China. China, before Donald Trump became president, was actually decommissioning coal-fired power plants. Not only weren't they building new ones and ramping up their coal, they were taking coal plants offline. They were doing far more than just about any other country to act. They were, producing massive numbers of solar panels, flooding the global marketplace with cheap solar panels. China was actually taking very bold actions based on the bilateral agreement that we had with China under the Obama administration, and that set the stage for Paris. And then we got a president who said, you know what, we are going to pull out of Paris. What sort of message do you think that sent to China and all the other countries? It sent the message that, the largest emitter, one of the two largest emitters on the planet, isn't serious about this. Why should we be? And so it took pressure off. And we actually saw that in the uptick in carbon emission numbers last year. We're actually able to trace that to the fact that China did start building new coal-fired power plants. And so the direct impact of Trump threatening to withdraw from Paris, fairly small. We're only responsible for a fraction of the world's emission. But the indirect effect, the impact that had on other countries and their commitment to meet their obligations was huge. And that's why we need a president who will, in fact, engage in the right international diplomacy and make sure that we are a leader in sending the right signals to the rest of the world when it comes to acting on climate.
Dr. Michael Mann, thank you so much. Great to have your time this morning.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Tomorrow on Rising, what do GOP voters want? Heritage Action for America's Executive Director Jim Chapman is actually going to give us a few ideas.
And the largest study of Latino voters came away with some pretty interesting conclusions on hopes for 2020. Hill TV's Jamal Simmons spoke with the president of the group behind that survey. Make sure you subscribe, folks. Hit the bell on YouTube so you know when we post every new video. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hill TV Live as well. Have a fabulous day. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.